Good day, everyone. This report is about the important dates and events in the development of Gestalt therapy. I will discuss the development of Gestalt therapy from Gestalt psychology and the pioneers or people behind the creation of Gestalt therapy and the significant events that leads to the creation of Gestalt therapy. For the intended learning outcome, after this report, students should be able to determine the difference between Gestalt psychology and Gestalt therapy, then understand the development of Gestalt therapy, and lastly, identify the salient events and pioneers of Gestalt therapy. The important dates and events in the development of Gestalt psychology started way back in year 1890. So von Ehrenfels, he introduced the concept of Gestalt to philosophy and psychology. He observed that a perceptual experience such as perceiving a melody or a shape is more than the sum of its sensory components. He claimed that in addition to the sensory elements of the perception, there is something extra. Although in some sense derived from the organization of the component sensory elements, this further quality is an element in its own right. He called it Gestaltqualität or form quality. So, followed by a few years later, in year 1910, the development of Gestalt psychology was influenced in part by his student, Max Wertheimer, on his observations that happens to be at a train station. So he purchased a toy stroboscope which displayed pictures in a rapid sequence to mimic the appearing movement. After that, in year 1912, Max Wertheimer's publication of results of his series of experimentation marks the beginning of the Gestalt psychology. So, through a series of experiments, he discovered that a person observing a pair of alternating bars of light can, under the right conditions, experience the illusion of movement between one location and the other. So he noted that this was a perception of motion absent any moving object. That is, it was pure phenomenal motion. He dubbed it, or he called it, phi motion. That was later on become a phi phenomenon from phi phenomenal. So now it was called phi phenomenon. It is the optical illusion of perceiving a series of still images, and it is a concept of isomorphism when viewed in a rapid succession as a continuous motion. So the phi phenomenon is similar to beta movement in that in both cause sensation of movement. However, the phi phenomenon is an apparent movement caused by luminous impulses in sequence, whereas the beta movement, is an apparent movement caused by luminous stationary impulses. In the phi phenomena, a sequence of images causes us to perceive a movement sensation. So the term isomorphism literally means sameness. The iso means sameness, and morphism means form. So in Gestalt psychology, isomorphism is the idea that perception and the underlying physiological representations are similar because of related Gestalt qualities. So isomorphism, it refers to a correspondence between a stimulus array and the brain state created by that stimulus. And it is based on the idea that the objective brain processes underlying and correlated with particular phenomenological experiences functionally have the same form and structure as those subjective experiences. So in comparison to von Ehrenfels and others who had used the term Gestalt earlier in various ways, Wertheimer's unique contribution was to insist that the Gestalt is perceptually primary. The Gestalt defines the part from which it is composed. So rather than being a secondary quality that emerges from those parts. So Wertheimer took the more radical position that what is given me by the melody does not arise as a secondary process rather, from the sum of the pieces as such. So instead, what takes place in each single part already depends upon what the whole is. In other words, one hears the melody first, and only then may perceptually divide it up into notes. So similarly, in vision, one sees the form of a circle first. It is given immediately, and only after this primary apprehension might one notice that it is made up of lines, or dots, or stars. Next, in year 1914, the first published references to Gestalt theory could be found in a footnote of Gabriel von Wartenslebens application of theory, the application of Gestalt theory to personality. So she was a student at Frankfurt Academy for Social Sciences who interacted deeply with Wertheimer and Kuhler. So in 1920s, Max Wertheimer he came up with various principles of Gestalt, some of which includes the principle of proximity, the principle of similarity, the principle of continuity, the principle of closure, and the figure ground principle. So this can be regarded as rules of the organization of perceptual scenes. So similarity, it's human nature to group like things together. So in Gestalt, similar elements are visually grouped regardless of their proximity to each other. They can be grouped by color, by shape, or by sizes. Similarity can be used to tie together elements that might not be right next to each other in a design. For continuation, the law of continuity posits that the human eye will follow the smoothest path when viewing lines, regardless of how the lines were actually drawn. So this continuation can be a valuable tool when the goal is to guide a visitor's eye in a certain direction. They will follow the simplest path on the page, so make sure the most vital parts they should see fall within that path. Under closure, it is one of the coolest Gestalt design principles and one that already touched on at the beginning of this piece. It's the idea that your brain will fill in the missing parts of a design or image to create a whole. In its simplest form, the principle of closure allows your eye to follow something like a dotted line to its end. Next one is proximity. It refers to how close elements are to one another. The strongest proximity relationships are those between overlapping subjects, but just grouping objects into a single area can also have a strong proximity effect. The opposite is also true, of course. By putting space between elements, you can add separation even when their other characteristics are the same. So lastly, the figure ground principle. It is similar to the closure principle in that it takes advantage of the way the brain processes negative space. So you've probably seen examples of this principle floating around in memes on social media or as part of logos. So your brain will distinguish between the objects it considers to be in the foreground of an image. So foreground as in the figure or the focal point, and the background or the area on which the figures rest. So in year 1921, Kurt Kafka published a Gestalt-oriented text on developmental psychology, The Growth of the Mind, which introduced Gestalt psychology to the readers of the United States of America. So, actually, in this time, since it all begins in the country of it all begins in Germany, introducing it to United States of America was kind of hard because in this time US is um US uses the the theory or therapy of behaviorism. So behaviorism um kalata doon sa US, so it was rejected, or it was not welcomed in the US in this time. So in year 1935, Kafka published his Principles of Gestalt Psychology. This textbook laid out the Gestalt vision of the scientific enterprise as a whole. Science, according to him, he said that is not the simple accumulation of facts. What makes research scientific is the incorporation of facts into a theoretical structure. The goal of the Gestaltists was to integrate the facts of inanimate nature, life, and mind into a single scientific structure. This meant that science would have to accommodate not only what Kafka called the quantitative facts of physical science, but the facts of two other scientific categories, the questions of order and the questions of sin. It is a German word which has been variously translated as significance, value, and meaning. So without incorporating the meaning of experience and behavior, Kafka believed that science would doom itself to trivialities in its investigation of human beings. So also in this year, all the core members of the Gestalt movement were forced out of Germany to the United States, having survived the Nazis up to the mid-1930s. So in this year, 1935, if we trace back on the history, dito nag-start, or in this time, nandito na yung Holocaust ni Hitler and yung Nazi Germany. So, in the year 1940, Kohler published another book. It is called Dynamics in Psychology. But thereafter, the Gestalt movement suffered a series of setbacks. From that year, 1940, after publishing the book, the Gestalt psychology, it faced a lot of setbacks in the following years. And these are, in the year 1941, Kurt Kafka died. Followed by 2 years later, but in year 1943, Max Wertheimer died. Okay? Then, in 1967, Wolfgang Kohler died. And as a result, the Gestalt was once again at a standstill. So, Gestalt psychology should not be confused with the Gestalt therapy, which is only peripherally linked to Gestalt psychology. The founders of Gestalt therapy are different from Gestalt psychology. The founders of Gestalt therapy are Fritz and Laura Perls, who had worked with Kurt Goldstein, a neurologist who had applied principles of Gestalt psychology to the functioning of the organisms. Also, Paul Goodman, who contributed a lot in creating the Gestalt therapy. So, Laura Perls had been a Gestalt psychologist before she became a psychoanalyst, and before she began developing Gestalt therapy together with Fritz Perls, her husband. Then the extent to which Gestalt psychology influenced Gestalt therapy is disputed, however. So in any case, it is not identical to Gestalt psychology, okay? So, on the other hand, Laura Pearls preferred not to use the term Gestalt to name the emerging new therapy because she thought that Gestalt psychologists they would object to it. On the other hand, Fritz and Laura Pearls clearly adopted some of the Goldstein's works. Thus, though recognizing the historical connection and the influence, most Gestalt psychologists they emphasize that Gestalt therapy is not a form of Gestalt psychology. Moving on to the important dates and events in the development of Gestalt psychology. So it all started in year 1933. So this year, Fritz and Laura Pearls, they fled Nazi Germany and moved to Amsterdam. So as I've mentioned before, in this time of year, the Holocaust or Hitler's leadership began. So as what we learned in our history class, Holocaust and the leadership of Hitler, it is very much chaotic. So they fled their country, they fled the Nazi Germany and moved to Amsterdam. So in 1934, the Pearls moved to Johannesburg, South Africa. After leaving in Amsterdam, they moved to South Africa where they established a psychoanalytic training institute. And there, they began to develop the core ideas of Gestalt therapy. After 9 years or so, in the year 1942, the first publication of Pearl's Ego, Hunger, and Aggression was also subtitled as A Revision of Freud's Theory and Method. It challenges and expanded upon traditional psychoanalytic thought. The year 1946, the couple, Fritz and Laura Pearls, moved to New York. So, by this time of year, World War II may have ended already. So, the couple, they live among extraordinary intellectuals, artists, and teachers in New York, continuing their immersion in diverse and sophisticated thinking. It was out of this stimulating atmosphere that the theory of Gestalt therapy was shaped and then put forth in the seminal work of Gestalt therapy, Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality. So, Paul Goodman, he actually co-wrote the theory behind Gestalt therapy. And he held psychoanalytic sessions through the 1950s while continuing to write prolifically. Followed by the year 1951, the term Gestalt therapy was actually first used as the title of a book. As I've mentioned, yung book na Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality. It was written by Frederick Pearls, Ralph Hefferline, and Paul Goodman. Shortly after, the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy was organized. So, many years later, in 1960, Fritz Pearls moves to west coast of the U.S., specifically in California. So, in 1964, Pearls, Walter Kempler, and James Simkin, they offered the first Gestalt therapy training workshops at the Esalen Institute. The approach, with its emphasis on directness and experiential method, became a central part of the human potential movement. And in 1970, I did not include it in the PowerPoint, but in 1970, Fritz Pearls actually died that year. So after that, there are no more recorded movement from Laura Pearls, Fritz Pearls, because he died that year. And the next record was in year 1980s, where many Gestaltists began to focus on the intellectual depth and long-term usefulness of the theory. So the Gestalt therapy now evolves and continues to spread in uh, in the field of practice. So this movement dovetailed with the psychotherapy community's interest in finding more inclusive models of practice. So many Gestalt therapists today are interested in how our own theories regarding oppression, power, and responsibility can be applied to remedy the harmful patterns that create disconnection. We, um, we are curious to experiment with expanding what these theories offer and see the possibilities for profound and far-reaching change for the 21st century. That is all for the development of Gestalt therapy. Thank you for listening.